Okay, good morning. Hi, my name is Sarah Ladislaw. I run the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS, and we're delighted to have all of you here with us today. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving and is all rested and ready for the sprint to the end of the year. We are really pleased today to be partnering with the Global CCS Institute to launch their annual report on the global status of CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. And today what we're going to do is have a conversation about the progress and the setbacks that were experienced in the evolution of carbon capture and sequestration technology, the near-term market opportunities, as well as what is required over the long term for CCS to reach its ultimate potential. And we're really pleased to have an excellent panel here that's going to be moderated by my colleague, Philip Benoit, who is a senior advisor and associate here at CSIS and has done a great deal of work on CCS over the course of his career. I'm going to allow him to introduce this panel before you, but we are especially pleased to have with us here today the 72-hour-old new Assistant Secretary of Fossil Energy, Steve Winberg. Fossil Energy, as you know, oversees the research and development activities at the U.S. Department of Energy for oil, coal, natural gas, and a host of other issues. And Steve is particularly well positioned to do this. He just had most recently came to the program as a senior program manager from Battelle Memorial Institute, but has a long history of working in the energy sector, managing technologies in the fossil-based energy world. So we wish him all the best of luck as he begins his new endeavors at the Department of Energy. He's going to have some opening comments about how he thinks about his new role and the role of CCS going forward. And then we'll open this up for a panel discussion after he takes some questions. Like we do for every event here at CSIS, I just want to remind you that in the event of some sort of security incident, please, myself and some of my colleagues standing in the back will be your security officers. We take your safety very seriously. Please follow our direction and we'll let you how to evacuate the building safely. Also, one more reminder that this event today is on the record and being webcast. So when it comes to answering questions or taking questions, please wait for a mic so that the people who are participating in the webcast can hear you and participate as well. So without further ado, please help me welcome Assistant Secretary Winberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am pleased to be here this morning, and it's good to see a few familiar faces. As Sarah said, I was sworn in on Wednesday, and then, of course, Thanksgiving weekend, so it's probably over 72 hours, but 72 working hours maybe. For those of you that I haven't met, before coming to DOE, I spent 39 years in the energy industry, most recently at Battelle Memorial Institute, and prior to that I was with Consol Energy, where I ran the R&D program. During my career, I've been involved in both policy and technology sides of the energy industry, particularly coal and natural gas, but also alternative fuels. While at Consol, I was given the opportunity to speak at a GCCSI meeting, so I'm well familiar with the important work that you all do. I'm less familiar with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, but I have seen some of your work, and I look forward to getting to know the work that you do much better. U.S. energy policy is guided by the goals of the President's America First Energy Plan, a plan that recognizes and embraces the fact that we have vast, untapped domestic energy resources in North America. In addition to being good for our economy, boosting domestic energy production is also in America's national security interest. And by encouraging U.S. energy exports, it benefits our friends and partners around the world. Our America First Energy Plan clearly states that developing our energy resources must go hand in hand with responsible stewardship of the environment, with an absolute need to protect our air and water. These things, energy development and environmental stewardship, are not mutually exclusive. In fact, technology-enabled solutions will allow us to balance and attain all of these goals. That's why the Trump administration is committed to advancing clean coal technology, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage. CCUS is a well understood approach for significant CO2 emission reduction from coal and gas power plants, as well as some industrial sources. These technologies, when coupled with supportive policies, can significantly reduce carbon emissions from traditional fossil fuels. Even though CCUS is being demonstrated around the world, we all know that there is a need to reduce the cost, and that investment in and development of CCUS technologies lags behind other clean energy technologies. One of the main reasons for this is the lack of strong policies to support CCUS research and demonstration. Policies that are aligned with the innovative era of energy abundance that we live in today. More robust policies for CCUS R&D will drive the cost down and help inform the myriad of issues needed to understand and resolve, to be understood and resolved to support the development of CCUS supply chains, commercial infrastructure, and private investment. This support is not a subsidy for fossil energy industry, just the opposite. CCUS should receive equal treatment with other clean energy technologies as part of a robust suite of low-emission energy solutions. Parity for CCUS will help to ensure a strong portfolio of clean, resilient, and affordable energy sources to succeed in growing our economy and improving our environment. But we should be clear, this doesn't mean a one-size-fits-all approach. Each country has its own goals and requirements, so the appropriate policy framework will necessarily vary among countries and across industries. In the United States, we're working to level the regulatory environment that has favored certain energy sources and technologies over others, and we're reviewing federal government regulations that impede domestic energy production and investment. Appropriate regulations are needed to strike a pragmatic balance between progress and environmental stewardship. We've seen that at the state level. Our Air Products CCUS project, the Petronova project, our Air Products and Petronova, both in Texas, and the Illinois Industrial CCUS project reflect how CCUS has been implemented where supporting regulatory, funding, commercial, and technical factors have converged to support a viable business case. Moving forward, additional projects should be catalyzed by smart policies that provide appropriate incentives to help offset the cost and promote successful development. While smart policies are necessary, research and development, learning by doing, can help drive down the cost of new technologies. For instance, the 21 large-scale CCUS projects in operation and under construction around the world provide an opportunity to facilitate the sharing of lessons learned and best practices. These projects are driving innovation by providing opportunities for testing, demonstrating, and refining advanced technologies while developing critical infrastructure that will facilitate and de-risk future projects through further cost reduction. In the U.S., the Department of Energy's Fossil Energy R&D program has supported and led world-class research on CCUS since 1998. DOE-supported first-generation CCUS technologies are now operating on both coal power plants and industrial applications. At the same time, a variety of advanced second-generation capture technologies have progressed to the small pilot plant stage. Our R&D program is also pursuing transformational technologies such as chemical looping, electrochemical-based approaches, supercritical CO2, advanced membranes, and advanced modeling and computational tools to identify materials and systems to reduce carbon capture energy and capital cost by greater than 50%. We're also focusing on advanced materials, sensors, and controls development to decrease the cost and increase the efficiency of both existing and new coal-fired generation plants. And we're pursuing new cross-cutting tools such as advanced simulation and additive manufacturing to further reduce these costs. Our CO2 storage efforts include a core R&D program designed to demonstrate that CO2 can be safely and economically stored underground. Over 15 million metric tons of CO2 have been injected in the United States as part of DOE's research, development, and demonstration programs, and that's combined. Our work is also complemented by the regional carbon sequestration partnership programs, which include 43 states, 4 Canadian provinces, and 400 organizations. The government-industry cooperative effort is developing guidelines for the most suitable technologies, identifying geological formations suitable for storage, informing the regulatory process, and identifying infrastructure needs for CCS in different regions of the United States and Canada. Going forward, our research and development will explore carbon capture from industrial and natural gas sources and the use of CO2 in enhanced unconventional oil and natural gas production. At the same time, we're exploring novel technologies for CO2 utilization beyond enhanced oil and gas recovery that can add additional commercial value to CCUS. In the end, though, the public and private sectors must do more to advance CCUS technologies from the laboratory to the commercial marketplace. In the U.S., we are working together as government and industry to address these challenges and barriers. For instance, Secretary Perry recently asked the National Petroleum Council, a 200-member industry advisory committee, to define pathways for commercializing CCUS. Just as public-private collaboration is critical to CCUS commercialization, so too are international partnerships. The U.S. has in the past and will continue to work with our partners in the international arena toward this goal. For instance, at the Clean Energy Ministerial in June, Secretary Perry stated that the U.S. feels strongly that CCUS should be included within the suite of clean energy technologies under consideration by CEM. We're also leading actions in collaboration with a number of countries to develop a new CEM initiative on CCUS, which we plan to formally launch at CEM 9 in May in Copenhagen. This initiative will strengthen the framework for industrial government collaboration on CCUS through complementary, value-added efforts beyond the activities of existing organizations and initiatives. Just last month, Secretary Perry and Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, co-chaired a CCUS summit ahead of the IEA's ministerial meeting. The participants from industry and government called for a renewed push for investment in CCUS. So the U.S. government remains a strong voice for CCUS, and we will continue to work in the global community to push for its commercialization. But at the end of the day, the challenges for CCUS are real, but there's also a lot of opportunities. Collaboration between industry and government and between international partners can help drive down CCUS deployment cost, develop best practices, and build on lessons learned to develop the policy frameworks that will promote the commercialization of CCUS. I thank you for your time, and we have time for some questions.
Name and affiliation and question in the form of a question, please. Yes, sir, Robert. He's coming.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What technology seems promising in terms of getting the cost down?
I think there's some attractive membrane technologies. There's also some advanced chemical technologies that are being evaluated, but I guess in the horse race, perhaps membrane technologies.
Hi, Amy Harder. I cover energy at Axios. I have two questions for you. First, can you address the fact that the Trump administration's budget slashes your office's budget and also specifically for CCUS technologies? And secondly, I actually spoke with the president of this institute in Bonn, Germany, and he said that the only reason why this institute exists is because of climate change. So can you address to what extent you think CCUS should be part of the solution to climate change? Thank you.
Sure. On the budget question, the president has made it very clear that he wants the Department of Energy to be focused on basic fundamental research, early stage research, and to a large degree, the Fossil Energy Office has been focused on early stage research and will continue to do that. Congress sets the budget, and we will manage the budget accordingly based on what Congress appropriates for us. With respect to the question of CCUS, if we're going to go down the road of significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it's pretty clear to anyone that looks at the mathematics that that needs to be done on a global basis. Not just a domestic basis. And I think it's also clear that if you run the math, CCUS has to be a part of it. We are not going to stop using fossil energy anytime soon. And so if we're going to go on an aggressive path towards CO2 reductions, CCUS or CCS simply has to be a part of the answer.
Thank you. Jeremy Harrell, ClearPath Foundation. In light of your comments about the administration's focused on basic research, earlier in your remarks you talked about the importance of U.S. deployment and demonstration of new CCS technologies. How do you view the demonstration of new technologies kind of fitting in that basic research focus? And what role do you think the National Carbon Capture Center plays in our ability to demonstrate new carbon capture technologies?
Across the spectrum within CCUS, there's a lot of work to do, from basic research to applied research through demonstrations. And so as I stated in the earlier question, the Department of Energy will manage the budget as it's presented to us, and if that is focused on basic research or focused on fundamental research, that's where we're going to focus our attention and efforts. And a lot can be done in that space. I think the first question was on reducing the cost of carbon capture. Hugely important. And a lot of basic research has to be done in order to get the cost of carbon capture down. In fact, from my perspective, I think that's probably the key to successful CCUS commercialization, is getting that cost down.
Hi, I'm Brad Crabtree with the Great Plains Institute and the NEORI Coalition. You rightly pointed out the lack of parity in terms of federal policy support for carbon capture. A critical gap that we have right now is that carbon capture lacks any kind of effective deployment incentive that other energy technologies benefit from and have for decades. So in that context, the previous administration, I realize the DOE is an executive branch agency, Congress enacts legislation, but the previous administration, through the Secretary of Energy and others, found ways to articulate support for the proposed extension and reform of the Section 45Q tax credit. Do you see this administration publicly supporting 45Q, especially given its likely consideration here at the end of the year?
Good question. I don't have an answer for you. 72 hours. But I appreciate the question, and I'll find out. But I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you today.
Okay, I have a couple really quickly. Assistant Secretary, you mentioned the importance of international collaboration. which has been a longstanding priority of different administrations. I think when I was at the Department of Energy, it was the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum. Each of them has sort of their own bent and their own flavor. One, what are you hoping to achieve through some of the new international collaboration on this issue in particular? What are the big things that you think should be tackled, and how are you finding other countries' receptivity to engaging with the United States on CCUS in particular? And then secondly, my sense is there's a priority within the administration on the R&D side, but on the policy side as well, to work with industry on finding solutions to some of these issues. How do you find support within industry for pursuing CCUS, in particular in the coal industry or even in the natural gas and oil industry? It seems to be a very dynamic space these days, people getting more involved and thinking about R&D on this side.
I think to the first question, I think that the agreements that Secretary Perry has undertaken over the last several months are pretty indicative of this administration's view on international collaboration. The Secretary will be heading over to the Middle East later this week with some more discussions on CCUS, so I think that's pretty indicative of his view on this. With respect to industry support, I think it's there, but having come from industry, and in particular the commodity industry, times are tough right now. They're tough with respect to coal companies, arguably even oil and natural gas, and certainly the equipment suppliers who have traditionally worked very closely with DOE. I have not had an opportunity yet to go out and talk to those two businesses, the commodity business or the equipment supplier business. I intend to do that and gauge their interest and their ability to support. But I think as a general statement, they're very interested in supporting. Whether or not that comes in the form of financial support remains to be seen.
Well, Assistant Secretary Winberg, thank you very much for spending your morning here with us. We know you got a lot to do, got to get your office set up and build on those 72 hours. So thanks very much for getting us kicked off on a great discussion this morning.
Oh, thank you, and have a great morning.
Okay, Philip.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you again, Assistant Secretary. I think your presentation, as well as the questions from the audience, really set out a very good foundation for our panel here. And I think, one of the questions that always hovers over the issue of CCS is, why are we still talking about CCS? And I think it's interesting to see the number of people in this room, basically it's standing room only, and so it clearly reflects the fact that there is an understanding that CCS or CCUS, and we'll come back to that, remains a potentially very important tool when we're thinking about climate change. So let me first briefly describe the panel members who will go up in turn. First, we're going to start off with Jeff Erickson, who's the General Manager for Client Engagement at the Global CCS Institute. And he previously worked at the nonprofit War Carbon Room, as well as ExxonMobil. And something I know that Jeff is going to do is he's going to give us an overview of some of the recent events over the last year in terms of CCS, as well as, and it would be useful, Jeff, if you could just maybe describe as part of your presentation for the audience what the Global CCS Institute is about. Then we'll be followed by Samantha McCullough, who's an energy analyst at the International Energy Agency and is responsible for some of the more recent seminal publications by the IEA, including this year's Energy Technology Perspectives, which looked at the issue, I believe, of how one goes well below 2 degrees, a real challenge. But I think more importantly, in terms of relevance for this particular session, she was the lead author of the seminal 2016 IEA report on 20 years of CCS, and I think Sam will give us a sense as to where we need to go and maybe some of the challenges. And then finally, we have Eric Redmond, who is a board member of the CCS Institute, but more importantly for the purposes of this discussion, is a businessman who has worked in various capacities on CCS projects. He's currently the CEO of Thunderbolt Clean Energy, which is an energy and consulting firm, and he was the former CEO of Summit Power Group, which was a developer of wind, solar, and carbon capture power plants projects. So look very much forward to the insights in terms of what's really happening on the ground from the business perspective. So Jeff, if you want to start off, take us through.
Great, thank you, Philip. And thank you, too, for the Center for Strategic and International Studies for hosting us today. I think it's appropriate for us to be discussing carbon capture at the center because carbon capture is a strategic and global issue that we all need to face. In fact, the transition to a low-carbon economy might be one of the most important issues that we face as a global community. For those of you who aren't familiar with my organization, the Global CCS Institute, we're a member-based organization whose mission is solely to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture. We're headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. There's 5 of us here in Washington, D.C., right up the red line, and we have colleagues in Calgary, Oslo, Brussels, Tokyo, and Beijing. We have about 65 members across the globe. They include governments, NGOs, large businesses, and small businesses. Some of those members are present here today with us. We were excited 2 weeks ago at COP23 in Bonn to launch our annual flagship report, The Global Status of CCS. I have a copy here, but it's easier for all of you to get a copy of that by downloading it from our website. So I want to share with you first some of the findings, and then I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have about the implications of those findings, both globally and here in the U.S. and North America. A few words about the report itself. It's a bit of a departure from the reports that we've published in the past. This year, rather than just focus on the facts of CCS, we've decided to tell the carbon capture story. We want to touch and connect with not just those insiders, those within the community of carbon capture advocates and proponents, but also those who are energy stakeholders, who are climate change stakeholders, who may not be as familiar with carbon capture. So we're telling the full story, and we're giving a bit more context. It's a great desk resource, if you will, one that can sit on your computer all year long, and there's plenty of information to it, regardless of how much knowledge you have about CCS. The report, interestingly, this year includes several external perspectives, not just from those that you might expect, but from some unexpected players as well. The father of the phrase global warming, Dr. Wally Brucker, has a perspective that we're sharing. There's a member of the UK Parliament that shares his perspective. The CEO of the Port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, who's taken a carbon capture project forward, also provides his perspective. And one that's probably most meaningful to me is a perspective from John Elkington. John is one of the grandfathers of the sustainable development movement, the corporate sustainability movement. He coined the phrase triple bottom line, and I personally feel that if John speaks out in favor of an issue such as carbon capture, I'm probably on the right side of that issue. We both shortened the report and lengthened it. What does that mean? In the past, we've had about a 25-page summary, and that was followed by about 200 pages of technical information that was available just to our members. This year, we've decided to make it all public, condensed it, reduced the font size, and it clocks in at about 83 pages this year. That's available to the public, available on the homepage of our website, globalccsinstitute.com. A few highlights from the report itself. It begins with an introduction by our CEO, Brad Page. He begins by saying, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the past year has been particularly momentous for carbon capture and storage. And then the report goes on to line out exactly what that means. And let's start here in North America. Right at the very end of December last year, going into 2017, Petronova commenced operations. The carbon capture facility at the Parrish Power Plant in Houston is run by NRG and is in many ways the model that many proponents of carbon capture point to as a successful project. It's capturing about 1.4 million metric tons per year, sending it about 70 miles down a pipeline, and is being used for enhanced oil recovery. Then in April, Archer Daniels Midland launched the world's first large-scale bioenergy carbon capture facility, the Illinois Industrial Project. That's capturing about 1 million metric tons per year and permanently storing the CO2 in a deep saline formation adjacent to the site. The carbon capture facility that's run by Air Products that the Assistant Secretary mentioned at the Port Arthur refinery in Texas passed a 4 million tons CO2 stored milestone this year. The Lake Charles methanol plant in Louisiana has a CCS facility that's in the advanced planning stages with support from a $2 billion conditional loan guarantee from the U.S. Department of Energy. The Net Power project plant outside of Houston is utilizing a new technology called the alum cycle. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. And that will be starting up soon, likely in the next couple of months. The Shell Quest facility, as we go north into Canada, is a hydrogen processing plant in Alberta. That just passed the 2 million metric tons of CO2 stored. And Boundary Dam, the world's first power plant with a large-scale carbon capture project on it, is now approaching the same milestone of 2 million metric tons stored. I'm not done yet. In Alberta, Canada, construction will soon begin on the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. There's 2 capture facilities associated with that. Between the 2 of them, a refinery and a fertilizer plant, they'll be capturing about 2 million tons per year of CO2. And I would be remiss not to mention one significant disappointment, the Kemper County Energy Facility. Ultimately, in July, Southern Company announced that the power plant would use natural gas rather than coal as its power source. And this was a disappointment for many of us in the carbon capture community, since although the carbon capture component of the plant worked as designed, it essentially became unnecessary and is not currently operating, not currently capturing CO2. The progress extended and extends beyond North America. In Norway, the 2 offshore storage facilities, Sleipner and Snøhvit, passed a cumulative 20 million tons of CO2 stored since the commencement of their operations. Sleipner began operating in 1996 and has been operating without an incident ever since. In Brazil, the Santos Basin offshore facilities passed the 4 million tons stored milestone. In Japan, there's a pilot project, and even in an area where there's a significant risk of earthquakes, they are conducting pilot testing for an offshore storage facility, and within the next 2 weeks, they'll reach about 100,000 tons of CO2 stored safely there. China is an emerging story, and the Yanchang CCS project down at Coal to Chemicals plant began construction in March of this year. That's the first large-scale carbon capture project in Asia that's currently under construction, and they'll be capturing 400,000 tons of CO2 for each year. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, in Australia, within the next few months, there will be a carbon capture facility that will be operational on an LNG plant in the western part of the country, and the expected start date is sometime in the first quarter. They'll be capturing about 4 million tons of CO2 per year. All in all, 17 large-scale carbon capture facilities operating globally, and 4 more coming online in 2018. These 21 facilities have a CO2 capture capacity of 37 million metric tons a year. That's equivalent to taking about 8 million cars off the road each year. There's 16 more large-scale facilities in the development phase, and many more that are in construction or operation, or in development on a smaller scale. Now, North America remains the carbon capture stronghold. It's home to 12 of the 17 operating large-scale facilities, plus 2 of the 4 that are currently under construction. The question is, how long will this dominant position on carbon capture last? The pipeline is shifting. As I mentioned, China is making significant inroads into carbon capture, first with the Yancheng facility, but in addition to that, 7 more large-scale carbon capture projects that are in planning and development in China, and those are expected to be operational sometime in the next 5 to 7 years. Europe has kind of reawakened. They've been dormant in Europe for several years with respect to progress on carbon capture. And let me just make a couple of comments about what's going on in Europe. Norway has a goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 and have committed to a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. They have a full chain carbon capture projects that's supported by the government. It's got 3 CO2 sources, a cement plant, an ammonia plant, and a municipal waste plant. They're going to be using a pipeline onshore, putting it on a ship, and sending it to an offshore storage facility. Norway actually sees the opportunity to become Europe's CO2 storage provider, and a lot of the depleted oil fields in the North Sea will provide that opportunity for them. In the Netherlands, the new government in the Netherlands has recently committed to a 49% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. As a part of that, they've committed 4 billion euros per year to boost new CO2 reduction technologies, carbon capture being one of those technologies. Really interesting in the Port of Rotterdam, a project that's just getting underway there. There was a project called ROAD, which has recently been, I'll say, abandoned and replaced with what they're calling in the Port of Rotterdam the Backbone CCS project. Now, the port has decided they're going to build a pipeline, and they're expecting all of their emitters that exist, and by the way, the port is enormous. It's responsible for about 20%, just the Port of Rotterdam, about 20% of the carbon emissions in the entire country. And the port has decided they're going to build a trunk line. They expect every one of their emitters, including refineries, chemical processing plants, and others, to connect, to capture their CO2, bring it to their property line. They'll take it from there. They'll transport it off sea. They'll take long-term responsibility for the CO2 as well. The interesting part of this, that's kind of the carrot. The interesting part of this is that the stick is that the port has said, if you're not going to play, if you're not going to be a part of this project, by mid-century, you're going to need to find a new place, a new home, because we want every one of our businesses in the port to be capturing or otherwise dealing with their CO2. And finally, in the UK, carbon capture has been included in their clean growth strategy. So that sounds very encouraging until you step back and take a look at the broader context. The IEA has said that to reach or to achieve the 2-degree climate objective, we're going to need to go from 17 large-scale operating carbon capture facilities to 2,500, from 17 to 2,500 by mid-century. So how do we get from here to there? Well, let's look at where the opportunities are. The Assistant Secretary was focused on the energy side of things, but there's an enormous opportunity, particularly here in North America, on the industrial side. Globally, the heavy industry produces about 21% of global emissions. And to achieve the 2-degree target, about half the CO2 reductions associated with carbon capture need to come from the industrial sector. So while a lot of us are often focused on coal plants, natural gas plants, the big opportunity in the near term in North America is in the industrial sector. In the power sector, natural gas plants, in a sense, there's been they've been encouraged to replace the higher emitting coal burning power plants, but that only gets you part of the way to the goal of carbon neutrality, or 80% reduction by mid-century. So carbon capture is going to be required on natural gas power plants as well. In power, it's not carbon capture instead of renewables. That's not the argument. It's how do we combine carbon capture and renewables. The most cost-effective grid is a combination of the two. So what's standing in the way? First is project economics. On a large scale, carbon capture makes good economic sense. On a project scale, it's still very challenging to create a project that comes out in the black. Carbon capture on power and on industrial can increase the cost anywhere between 2% and 70%. The lowest incremental cost is at facilities that already separate their CO2 as part of the industrial process. What can we do to improve the project economics? First, we can provide policy incentives, as the Assistant Secretary mentioned. But the other thing that's very exciting is to reduce the cost through innovation. We can't talk about policy in DC without at least mentioning 45Q. Brad Crabtree brought that up just a minute ago. There's bills in both houses and to extend and enhance the tax credits, and if those do get passed, that would be a critical step in improving the economics of carbon capture, and in my view, it will result in additional carbon capture facilities in place. The second lever is on project economics is innovation, and that's the part that's really exciting to me. I think we'll see innovation in 3 ways. One is this kind of incremental improvement, making things better than the last generation, And the project owners that have built carbon capture projects say the next time they build one, it's going to be a 20 to 30% reduction in cost just from what they've learned. The second is what I would call breakthrough technologies, and the two best examples here in North America are the alum cycle. It's being deployed at the Net Power facility, where they're actually using CO2 as part of the power generation process. That has the potential to generate power with carbon capture at cost parity to unabated power plants. And the other that we have our eye on is the fuel cell energy technology, where what that is being applied to coal and natural gas plants. The difference there is that rather than taking energy from the power plant to run the carbon capture plant, it actually has the opportunity to increase the power production from the plant. So those breakthrough technologies, I think, are really exciting. The third kind of innovation is business model innovation, changing the way that we make money, and project owners make money at the business of carbon capture. So if I step back and look at the conclusions and the storyline in the status report, I have 4 key takeaways. The report includes very compelling evidence that carbon capture is proven, it's affordable, it's versatile, and it's essential. North America remains the carbon capture stronghold, but its leadership position is increasingly at risk. Europe is back, China is committed, Japan is innovating. The third is that industrial carbon capture is where the big near-term opportunity is, particularly in this hemisphere. And fourth, innovation is changing the way we think about carbon capture. It will look very different in 10, 15 years than it does currently. Thanks for your attention. Let me hand it back to Philip, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great, Jeff. Thanks a lot for that very nice and interesting overview. I think one point we'll come back to in the question and answer period is you talked a lot about innovation and a variety of issues to drive down costs and some tax credits, but at the end of the day, carbon capture still costs a lot of money. And so the question is, where is there fundamentally going to be an incentive to encourage businesses to spend that money? Now I'll turn to Sam, who will provide us with more of an international perspective from the International Energy Agency side. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to the Institute and the Centre for the opportunity to be here today. Many of you would be familiar with the International Energy Agency. We're a Paris-based organisation with government membership across the world. We have a dedicated CCS team within the organisation, and we primarily look at CCS technologies from the global perspective in terms of global energy systems and the role of CCS technologies in energy transformations, including with consideration of energy security, environmental and climate imperatives. Jeff did mention that we model a 2-degree scenario, and in particular CCS plays a key role in limiting future temperatures to 2 degrees. It's the third most important technology contribution after renewables and energy efficiency. And it plays a role particularly in industry and in the power sector. Now, I think to put into context why we need the CCS, I think with recent developments, we've had remarkable success stories with renewable energy, with improvements in energy efficiency and energy intensity. We've even had 3 consecutive years of global energy sector emissions flatlining. And I think this has given rise in some areas to a sense that perhaps we don't really need CCS. Now, to put that into context and perhaps look at the gap between where we're heading and where we would need to be heading to be consistent with climate goals, the IEA maps a scenario that's based on current policies, looking at where current technology trends are taking us, where current policy action and commitments, including those that are associated with the Paris Agreement, would take us. And the gap between that and a 2-degree outcome remains enormous. We've really barely scratched the surface of what we would need to do to get to a 2-degree target. The gap represents around 740 gigatons of CO2 between now and 2060. And to put that into perspective, it's around 20 years worth of current global energy sector emissions that would need to be abated in around a 40-year time period. And it's clear to us that we will need all technologies and all strategies available at our disposal to really close this gap and meet this challenge. So the role of CCS in our modelling and as we see it in the future, certainly industry is a key area. Jeff mentioned this already. There are a few technology options outside of CCS that can deliver the really deep decarbonisation in some industrial sectors that will be needed, also recognising that industry accounts for almost a quarter of global CO2 emissions, so it's a sector that deserves more attention in climate discussions. But particularly steel, cement, chemicals, fertilisers are all sectors that will continue to provide the building blocks of modern society and economic growth. And we do need solutions to address the emissions from these sectors. In the power sector, CCS can play an important role in supporting electricity security objectives, in supporting diversity in fuel use, recognising that countries are continuing to use fossil fuels. And in this regard, I'll touch on particularly coal. Now, while CCS is not a coal technology, it's certainly much more than just being a coal technology. It's really particularly important for coal. And the reality today is that 40% of global electricity is still provided by coal. Last year alone, 83 gigawatts of new coal generation capacity was added globally. This is more than any other fuel. And we have a large and quite a relatively young fleet of coal units around the world. So more than half of the generators currently in operation were added since 2000, the year 2000. And conceivably, many of these plants could still be operating towards the middle of the century. So CCS is a really important solution to avoid the lock-in of emissions from these facilities, while also protecting some of the investment that has been made in these assets. So despite growing recognition of the importance of CCS in meeting climate goals and in a sustainable energy future, it's still very much being left behind in terms of even as we're seeing the global energy transformation really start to build some momentum. And to look at the IEA, we also track energy sector investment. And 2016 was somewhat of a record year. We had $850 billion globally invested in low carbon energy. Around $300 billion of this went to renewables. $230 billion was invested in energy efficiency measures. CCS fell quite a bit behind, and it accounted for about 0.1% of the low carbon energy spend. Now, the good news there, if we can take some good news away from that, is that this investment occurred here in the US, associated primarily with the Petronova project, which we've already heard about. But I think Petronova is a really excellent case study. It certainly cements the US leadership in this space. But in terms of being able to build a business model and a business case for investment in a CCS facility in a more challenging application of CCS, but working with the US government with some grant funding, taking advantage of revenue streams from EOR, Enhanced Oil Recovery, partnering with international organisations, in this case the Japanese technology providers, MHI, and also delivering a project of this nature on time and on budget. So in the CCS terms, this is an incredible success story, and we'll certainly need to see more and more Petronovas being built. The other point is that it's been built at a substantially reduced cost to the first coal-fired power station with CCS. So we need to maintain this momentum in terms of project deployment. So perhaps that brings me to the title of this event, as it was the question that was posed on the flyer for this morning's discussion, which was, will technology and market forces spur a new wave of investment in CCS projects? At the risk of being somewhat pessimistic, I think the answer to that question is probably no. I think technology and market developments are not going to see CCS deployed at the kind of scale and pace that will be needed to be consistent with climate goals. That's not to say that there aren't positive developments in that space. Jeff touched on some of the technology developments and the cost reductions that we're seeing through innovation and technology. But no matter how cheap these technologies get, at the moment there's limited incentive to actually invest in them. There's currently no disincentive to emit the CO2. And on the market side, we've seen enhanced oil recovery being the key driver of investment to date, predominantly in the US and Canada. But interest in EOR is certainly spurring some growth in CCS projects, particularly in the Middle East and particularly in China, and that's very promising. But these EOR opportunities are necessarily limited by geology and geography, so they're not an alternative in themselves to doing the harder work in terms of designing policy incentives and providing the support to CCS that we've seen enjoyed by other technologies with great success. I would perhaps just end on making the point, the Assistant Secretary mentioned that recently the International Energy Agency hosted a CCS summit. It was in the sidelines of our ministerial meeting. It was co-chaired by Secretary Perry, and we had very high-level engagement from ministers and top government officials from 10 or 12 countries, from key CCS countries in terms of the countries that are likely to benefit from CCS deployment. We also had incredibly strong engagement from industry at CEO level. We had the CEO of ExxonMobil, CEO from BP, Shell, companies like Total, Chevron, GE Power, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry. It was, in my experience in CCS, an unprecedented level of engagement between industry and government on this issue, and I take some encouragement from that, in that there is very strong recognition. There was a strong call for a greater boost to our international effort on CCS. So I think that's providing a really strong platform, in addition to the project developments that we're seeing and some of the milestones that Jeff mentioned. It's a really good starting point, I think, for a much strengthened effort on CCS moving forward. I'll hand it back to Philip.
Great, thanks a lot for that. Some very interesting points. I note that you emphasized the point that Jeff had made, which is that when we're talking about CCS, it's not just about power. A lot of it's about industry, and particularly in North America, and I think that's an important point to come back to. I'm glad to see you pivoted also into the issue of coal and power. Obviously, at COP23, there was a lot of discussion about clean coal, something that the Assistant Secretary referred to, and I guess there were some questions in the context of COP23 as to whether clean coal is an oxymoron, and I think that's something that we probably should discuss. But I think you've also touched upon the point that Jeff was also alluding to, the issue of incentives. Congratulations on that IEA conference, which I believe was CCUS. It's always interesting. We sometimes say CCS, sometimes we say CCUS, and there's a big difference in there. And I guess the hope is that without, maybe the best incentive we can get is by having some U, but I think there's some questions about that. And so I'm sure that's something we'll be talking about as well in the questions and answers section. At this point, I'd like to turn over to Rick to give us more of a business perspective.
Thank you, Philip. I'm Eric Redmond, known as Rick to many of you in this room. I am, as mentioned earlier, a director for 1 month now of the Global Carbon Capture and Sequestration Institute. I think I'm the only American director of the Institute. I'm a member of the Scottish Carbon Capture Association, and I'm also have a faculty appointment at University of California, San Diego, working on the Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which we call D2I. But today, I am speaking in the capacity, or was asked to speak as someone who's had business experience trying to get CCS projects done. For about 10 years, I was successively the president, CEO, and then the co-chairman of Summit Power Group. And at Summit Power, we developed renewables. We had developed 1,000 megawatts of operating wind projects, the second largest solar project in California, and as well as a number of others. And we embarked upon 2 carbon capture and sequestration projects, the Texas Clean Energy Project, which is, after an enormous amount of work, came tantalizingly close to to being constructed and would have made a huge difference in the world had it been constructed. And we have a parallel project in Scotland, which is still going on, which is now pivoted to carbon capture from natural gas. It's called the Caledonia Clean Energy Project, and it's envisioned as the anchor tenant of an industrial cluster in the Grangemouth area, which is near Edinburgh in Scotland. Personally, I got into carbon capture and sequestration for climate. The climate math doesn't permit us to ignore carbon capture. And renewables, which a lot of people in America seem to think is the climate issue, they're not. They're a tool in the climate toolkit, but they're just one tool. And as you know, a tremendous number of the emissions are coming not from the power sector, and even within the power sector, there is no Mark Jacobson solution. You can't run the power sector entirely on renewables, no matter how much storage or no matter how much transmission you put in, because you still need firm capacity. And you can't get it from the battery, because you can never have a battery that has enough storage in it to take care of the situation in which 2 weeks of no wind and no sunshine. So there's just no way to avoid having to have something that firms up. It doesn't necessarily have to be from fossil, but there has to be something to firm up the grid. But most importantly, the power sector is only one portion of the total emissions of greenhouse gases, and if we're going to deal with climate, we've got to get the other sectors as well. Industrial was mentioned, and I just would point out that the largest single source of CO2 emissions humans cause on the planet is now an industrial facility at Ningxia, China, where there are 28 Siemens gasifiers gasifying coal for the purpose of producing methanol, all of which is being turned into plastic. There is no renewable energy solution for that. In fact, although the Chinese are building the largest solar project in the world to help power that facility, they're also building 12 gigawatts of unabated coal to help power that facility. So it's a massive amount of CO2 being produced in a spot that makes sense for China because it's limiting their imports of natural gas and plastics. The question of cost is really interesting. When we started on the Texas Clean Energy Project, it was a different question altogether, which was availability. Can you design a plant that will run with the availability of another plant? And that's what we designed the plant to do. Siemens was willing to give a guarantee on the availability of the plant that would be equal to the guarantee they had for any natural gas plant, reduced only by the upstream forced outage risk in the gasification process. So that was designed to make it financeable. Because it was a beginning project, we weren't trying to maximize efficiency, so cost was always going to be higher than it would be for the nth project. And this is a key on carbon capture and sequestration. These projects, the big ones, are very big, and you've got to come down the cost curve, and you start by getting one that will work and you can finance, and then through successive plants, you get down to the nth plant. We haven't done that in CCS. That large scale is a big problem. And what we encountered included the fact that if you build these really large-scale projects, and this was, a very large project, you have a long construction time. That means a lot of interest during construction, a lot of cost associated with that. Contractors want 4 years to build the plant. That's a lot of money to have out there without any revenue, and so forth. One of the biggest problems is the contractors don't know where the business opportunity is. They don't know how many of these plants are going to be built, and so they're not prepared to take giant losses on the first plant. And moreover, I think the single biggest thing that affected us and has affected the whole sector in the U.S. is that Kemper has had terrible cost problems. And so in the case of the Texas Clean Energy Project, we had signed EPC contracts, fixed price lump sum turnkey contracts signed at a price that was more than $1 billion less than ultimately the contractors insisted on. And all of that increase came from the fear that they had that they would really be losing a ton of money based on what was happening at Kemper. And no matter how much you tried to explain to them that the two situations were not comparable, you could not get that out. So scale is an issue, and the time that it takes to construct is an issue. There are a couple of solutions to this. One is, of course, to find smaller scale things to get going on. Nth Power is not small at all, but Nth Power is much smaller than the type of project we were talking about. I'm also working with a technology company called Wormser Energy Solutions, which has found a way to do gasification of coal with carbon capture on a much, much smaller scale by using steam as the reactive element with the carbon. The advantage of steam, of course, is that it has a lot of hydrogen in it, and what you're trying to get out of these plants is hydrogen. And so it's possible to do factory-built components, much shorter field time, and I think can produce a great reduction in cost. But this question of R&D versus deployment, I think where we are in a climate world is it's like we're in a leaky lifeboat, and we're all together in this leaky lifeboat. And some people in the boat are saying, you know, we could get a really great pump. We could probably build a pump out of the materials that we have here in the boat. And if I'm the person in the boat, I want to say to them, I encourage you to do that. I think that's a really great idea. But meanwhile, it would make sense to bail. It would make sense to plug the leaks, you know, with what we have. And the thing that just blows my mind about CCS is people do not seem to realize that we have plenty of commercial technology available for this right now. Plenty. Yes, cost is an issue, but there are some of the biggest companies in the world are willing to guarantee their technology to capture carbon. They're willing to guarantee their technology to do all these things. They don't need a new membrane. You know, they can do it right now today. But there is an added cost if you have no added revenue source. That's why Net Power and Wormser, which I just mentioned, their whole focus is how can we make these plants work without an added cost? How can we get the cost down so there is no added cost? But there still needs to be a carbon capture infrastructure developed. There has to be pipeline infrastructure. We're going to talk about CCUS. And I'm really glad to see carbon used for many products and other things. And I'm very familiar with the enhanced oil recovery because the Texas Clean Energy Project depended on it. It had more revenue would have had more revenue from enhanced oil recovery than from the sale of electric power. But we have to recognize the scale of carbon emissions that are involved globally and the scale of those that need to be sequestered. And I think you can think of any product that can be made in enhanced oil recovery, and you still will have excess carbon that has to be geologically sequestered if you're going to have a successful climate application of CCS. There's much more to say, but I think that took care of my 8 minutes, and I think I should stop at that point, but I hope I'll have a discussion and can cover some others. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for keeping the time, all of you. So I think this very much lays out a good foundation for a discussion that follows on the presentation from the Assistant Secretary today. And I think I'd like to pick on something that you mentioned at the end, Rick, because you started to talk about the issue of use. And I think in some ways this goes back to arguably one of the fundamental challenges that we see on CCS. So in some ways it's easy to talk about innovation. It's easy to talk about driving down costs. But part of the problem we have on CCS is what is the incentive to actually spend money on CCS? The only major benefit, and it was in one of the questions that somebody asked in the first session, is really about climate, unless we can find some nice use. And I think, Rick, you started talking about the fact that maybe when we think about use, and I know this is something that USDOE is interested in, the IEA seminar was very interested in this, the Chinese are very interested in finding some use, some way to monetize that effort. But Rick, I think as you pointed out, that may be somewhat limited. So my question is really twofold. On the one hand, in this dynamic where it seems like most of the benefit from CCS is really tied to some climate benefit, what is it that we would need to do in order to create the financial incentive for people to want to spend the money, irrespective of whether the costs have gone up or gone down, but fundamentally, how can we generate a financial incentive or regulatory incentive for people to want to spend money on CCS? And then the second thing is to what extent, and this obviously applies to all three of the people on the panel, to what extent do you think that actually use is an important part of the solution, or maybe an important part of the strategy to help us get to an ultimate solution? So incentives on the one hand, and use as part of the second question.
If that's for me, let me say, first of all, that there are a couple of approaches to it. One is that, as I mentioned, Net Power and the other company I'm working with, Wormser Energy Solutions, their approach is to say, let's just get the cost down to what the cost would be if someone built another power plant without carbon capture or another industrial plant without carbon capture. Remove the cost penalty by coming up with things that will work better. So there are people working on that particular issue. As far as the use goes, enhanced oil recovery is not just a possible use for a small volume. It could be an enormous volume. In fact, it's almost inconceivable that we'd run out of space doing enhanced oil recovery. And it is, of course, a lower carbon method of producing oil than any other method. So it has a net carbon benefit, and it's really worth doing, and it provides some revenue. But I think that, fundamentally, to go back to just where you started, Philip, the real problem of climate, step back, it's that the atmosphere has been treated like a free landfill with no tipping fees, and people can just dump stuff into it and they don't have to pay a tipping fee. And yet, if we assume the capacity of that landfill is limited, which it is for climate purposes, then you have to start creating a world in which it costs money to take up the remaining headroom in the atmosphere. I spent many years in China working on, because we had Chinese contractors and Chinese financing for the Texas Clean Energy Project. And their view, China's a big country, not everyone has the same view, but sort of the official view was, look, you people in the West got rich using up all the headroom in the atmosphere. And now there's this tiny amount of headroom left, and we're trying to get rich too, or at least we're trying to get a whole society up to a decent standard of living. And you've used it all up, and now you want us to stop using it up, the remaining amount. There's a deal to be done there, but it's a deal that requires the West and the developing countries to think, okay, how do we bear the costs of preventing the rest of the atmosphere being used up? And I do think that, of course, it's going to be critical to get the cost down to the level of the alternatives, but I do think that unless globally and societally we recognize that you've got to have a tipping fee to put more junk in the atmosphere, I think it's going to be really hard to achieve our climate goals, period, leaving aside just carbon capture and sequestration.
Yeah, if I could, I would say something a little bit different than what Rick said. First of all, if you want to incentivize more carbon capture facilities, there's essentially two ways to do it. One is you mandate limits to carbon emissions, and the other is you improve the project economics. And there's only two ways you can improve project economics, right? You can either reduce the cost or increase the income. And the innovation that's occurring is an opportunity to do both. The utilization space, and I'll call it the non-EOR utilization space, is exciting. It excites NGOs, it excites venture capitalists, and it excites banks. Those kind of non-traditional stakeholders in carbon capture, and that's a great thing. We need to recognize, too, that this is an industry or a set of industries in its infancy, right? If you look at the opportunity for utilization, 98, 99% of it right now is in enhanced oil recovery. Now, that number is going to go down, and the other number, the products number, is going to continue to go up. But it's going to happen over a long period of time. So I'm absolutely for finding ways to make money by other types of utilization of CO2. Let's just not take our eye off the big near-term opportunity. We can do both, and we should do both. I think, if you look back at the wind industry, for example, 40 years ago, it wasn't even round off on our energy equation, and now it's approaching 10% globally. Right? Who would have expected? I think that's the way utilization is going to happen as well. China, as Philip said, is very interested in the utilization piece. This may be the element of carbon capture that they decide to corner, is utilization. So it's an exciting space, but let's not forget the near-term opportunity with the expectation that space is going to grow quickly.
Well, I agree with much of what's been said. Just to touch on the utilisation, certainly EOR has been a key driver of investment in CCS, and we see that continuing in certain economies. There's growing interest in more novel capture or utilisation opportunities. I think they need to be assessed primarily with two criteria, and that is the scalability. How much is it really going to contribute to addressing the emissions, given the scale of the emissions that we're currently looking at globally, but also the permanence of the sequestration. Are we just re-releasing it? So I think, yes, we should be very much pursuing these opportunities with utilisation, but with some degree of caution in terms of understanding how they're going to fit. They're not necessarily an alternative, well, they're not an alternative to still investing in the permanent storage and saline aquifer storage. Just on incentives, I thought it's worth noting that the incentives needed for a successful CCS investment very much varies from project to project and industry to industry. And just to highlight the Sleipner CCS project, which has now been operating for more than 20 years, the incentive was a government-imposed offshore carbon tax for the oil and gas industry in Norway. And I think at the moment it stands at around $50 or $60 per tonne. I'm not sure what it was in 1996 or so when it was introduced, but it was sufficient for the offshore LNG project, which was already separating the CO2, to look at opportunities to re-inject. And that project's now stored more than 17 million tonnes of CO2 for an initial capital investment of less than $100 million US. So there are these low-hanging fruits, if I can use that terminology, in CCS, and if we can look at opportunities to provide the incentives for some of these targeted projects that are delivering global benefits in terms of the technology development and the learnings, then I think that's worth pursuing. I also think in terms of cost reductions, yes, technology and innovation is very important. There's incremental improvements. There's some promising breakthrough technologies, including net power, and if net power works, that's potentially a game changer for CCS in the power sector. But we also need to keep in mind that there's significant opportunities for cost reductions just in how we deploy these projects. And this is very much a focus in Europe with the hub and cluster approach, where we're looking at multi-user transport and storage infrastructure, optimizing how we invest in the infrastructure to be able to allow new capture projects to come online at significantly reduced cost than those first-of-a-kind projects. And there's a strong role, I think, for governments and industry to really be working together to identify where these hubs are. The Port of Rotterdam, which Jeff mentioned, is one opportunity that's being pursued, but there would be others. And I think, again, looking at it from a regional or a local hub level can really deliver some cost reductions and start to close that commercial gap for CCS investment.
Great, thanks for those very interesting responses. Now I'd like to turn to the audience. If you have any questions, again, if you could just state your name and then state the question relatively concisely. So, okay, let's start at the back.
Amy Harder from Axios. I wanted to ask you, following up from my question that I asked the Assistant Secretary regarding climate change, do you think that CCS can be scaled up to the level that one of you said, I think 2,500 plants by mid-century? Do you think that can be done without climate change being a priority? If each of you can just answer sort of yes or no and elaborate if you would like. Thank you.
No, I don't.
Why don't we take a couple of questions and then you can answer. So otherwise that will be too yes, no, and that'll go too fast.
Hi, Ponciano Manalo with IHS Markit. I just wanted to get some quick comments on direct air capture. Do you think it's possible? Is it a pipe dream? Is it possible? So just a couple of comments on that.
Okay, thanks. Answer, if you could answer both.
We're not going to answer the first one. I'd answer no to the first question. On direct air capture, you know, originally people thought this was a really silly idea, and I was one of the people who thought it was a silly idea. And there's also this whole moral, ethical thing about if you can do it really well and cheaply, are people going to treat that as a license to put more stuff in the atmosphere? But I think from a climate standpoint, I don't think the climate math is going to work without direct air capture. The transportation sector, for example, it's going to be really hard to get that carbon out. It will electrify as much as we can, but there'll still be airplanes and things like that. So I think there's going to have to be direct air capture, and there are people working on it, and they're actually producing now units that are actually in operation, commercial operation, and there will be more. The great thing about direct air capture is that you're not working in a difficult environment. The air, the ambient air, you know, oxygen is not corrosive at ambient temperatures and things like this. It's so much easier than working with flue gas. And the second thing is, it doesn't matter what percentage of the carbon you capture. If we have a plant and we're only capturing 40% or something, that's kind of bad. You really got to get 90, 95%. With direct air capture, it just matters what's the cost per ton. And that cost is coming down. And I really believe, this is my own personal, really strong belief about direct air capture, everybody's looking at the costs as if these are standalone plants, these direct air capture plants. But if the technology gets good enough, you won't do them as standalone plants. You will couple them with some other plant that's capturing carbon, but gets up to like 94%, and that last 6% is really expensive. And at that point, the cost of direct air capture is a really good way to get to 100% or to negative emissions for that plant. So I think that it's an absolutely vital sector, and I'm glad people are working on it. And I just try to remind people, when you capture the carbon, you still have to do something with it. So direct air capture itself is another reason why we'll have utilization, but ultimately, because of the numbers, you have to do geological sequestration as well. So you have to have an infrastructure to do that.
Sam?
Just on the first question, no, I don't think we'll see CCS being scaled up to those levels without some kind of climate imperative. But I just want to make the point that, often the IEA scenarios are very much set as as somewhat of a benchmark of where CCS needs to get to. We run an optimised pathway to achieving a climate objective in the case of the 2-degree scenario. In that scenario, we end up with around 6 billion tonnes of CO2 being captured every year by 2060. This doesn't necessarily mean that this is how CCS must play out. I think even if we had half that amount of CCS being deployed across the world, that would be a successful outcome, and it would be making a major contribution to climate goals. So I think I wouldn't be too fixated on the sort of end numbers in terms of the scale of how many projects that we will need. And on direct air capture, potentially a breakthrough in terms of CCS, in terms of the whole climate mitigation effort, but the cost challenge is significant. I know some of the projects are targeting costs of $100 a tonne. That could start to play into being very, very economic from the 2030s, I think, with as a mitigation technology, but we're a long way from that. So I think it has potential. We should be looking at it, but with perhaps not too much optimism in terms of the time frame that the cost will come down.
Jeff? I guess if I could just add something, I think the answer on whether we get there is no, even in a moderate form, unless we get some type of climate policy. I mean, Rick, you used the term tipping fee. I mean, tipping fee basically is, carbon tax, some type of mandate or the like. Unless we get some major disruptive technological innovation, the way every time we look at CCS, at the end of the day, there's a cost associated with it. The cost may be lower if we lower the cost through innovation, but at the end of the day, fundamentally, there needs to be some financial or other regulatory incentive to push people to actually invest in CCS, because use at this point doesn't seem like it'll get us there. Questions maybe on this side?
Hi, I'd like to build on the previous question a little bit. Can you expand on, well, I guess I could put this into a yes or no question. Do you think we're going to be able to deploy direct air capture or a bioenergy CCS without building a robust, regular old CCS infrastructure and massive deployment? Are we going to get to that? Everyone's interested in lately in carbon removal because the IPCC says we need it after 2060. But are we going to get to that if we don't have CCS as a foundation?
Well, when I was at Summit and I was dealing with the developers of the direct air capture technologies, 3 of them, I said to them, you're all looking at your costs on a standalone basis. And whatever your costs are on a standalone basis, if we combine it with this power plant, your cost per ton of capture will be reduced by 50%. And the reason is because if you combine it with another plant that's capturing carbon anyway, you're doing all the financing together, you're doing all the permitting, you're doing all the construction, you're getting all the contractors to do the whole thing, and you're doing all the marketing of the CO2 if it's being sold for EOR. You just totally change the economics of direct air capture if you combine it with other plants. And I think they would concede that, but they look around, they say, but the other plants aren't getting built, so they're working as hard as they can to reduce their own costs. But I don't think in the long run that you can do direct air capture at the scale that needs to happen, which is more than just making bricks or algae, without combining it with the overall CCS infrastructure. The scale of these things on the use, I want to go back to that for a minute. it's really hard for people to comprehend how much tonnage of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere and how much tonnage the usage can take up other than EOR. And one of the things we calculated one day is that if you captured 95% of the carbon from a really big coal plant in the United States, and you wanted to use that to provide CO2 to an algae farm for biofuels, the size of the reservoir or the tank, whatever, would be Lake Champlain. And this is enormous amounts of carbon we're talking about, and the uses so far are not of a scale that would match that. So that's why you have to go to geological sequestration.
Jeff?
Yeah, well, this is a question of and, not or, just as carbon capture is with renewables. And globally, we have way more storage capacity geologically than we need to address the CO2 challenge. The problem is a mismatch between where the sources are and where the storage is. So you're going to need to build out, and as Rick said earlier, once you capture, you're going to have to do something with it, whether it's direct air capture or coming off of an industrial plant or a power plant. So that infrastructure, that the pipeline network is one that will be able to be utilized and necessary to be utilized, not just by the industrial capture, but also the direct air capture as well.
Yeah, hi. The trees are really good at sequestering carbon. Brett Kilgmass, consultant. So trees are really good at sequestering carbon. The technology is already there. Where does reforestation fit into the mix? And even going beyond that into policies such as replacing cement buildings with wood buildings as a more permanent storage as well?
Robert Lanza from ICF. I had a question concerning the regulatory incentives. You'd mentioned, Mr. Erickson, that the Port of Rotterdam had a carrot and stick approach, that the carrot was that we'll take all your CO2. The stick is you have to send it to us. Last year we had a stick in the United States, and this year we don't. One of the arguments against having a stick in the U.S. over the course of the past couple of years is that CCS was not a demonstrated technology, that the power plants were being compelled to implement a emerging technology that was not demonstrated. So my question to the panel is, CCS a demonstrated technology? Meaning if we get to the point where we're going back to a regulatory approach, will the same argument still exist that power plants would be compelled to implement an emerging technology that's not demonstrated? Or do you think that argument can be successfully countered?
Yeah, whenever I hear arguments about something not being demonstrated technology or not being economical, I always think back to the auto industry in the 60s when the government said that every automobile needed a seatbelt. And the auto industry came back and said the cost is going to be exorbitant, people are going to stop buying cars, right? And in any case, they're not going to use the seatbelts. And now every commercial that you see touts the number of airbags that a car has and other safety features. So I understand the argument. I also think that over time, the costs, especially as industries and projects scale up, the cost is going to continue to come down. We have seen that it's demonstrated on multiple, that the capture element is demonstrated on multiple types of industries, including coal-fired power plants. There's pilot projects that are occurring with various types of power plants. And so I think while you cannot build a carbon capture facility on the back of a power plant today and make money off that facility, the economics of that will change over time. I think it's demonstrated, and in a lot of countries in the world, that's the approach that they're taking.
I would go back to something I said earlier. People just do not comprehend the fact that very big companies are perfectly willing to guarantee and warrant the performance, the cost, the availability of their carbon capture technologies today. The capture piece is not something that is you can't find commercial for. In the Texas Clean Energy Project, to just mention that again, we had guarantees from biggest companies in the world on price, on schedule, on availability, on performance, on emissions. All of those things were guaranteed with huge liquidated damages if they failed to meet them. And they were confident of their ability to do it as long as they got the price high enough to cover their Kemper-type risks. And that's what made it too expensive at that point. But if those projects can get built, it's not for lack of commercial technology or lack of commercial warranties right now. That's not the thing holding them up. Technology is not the issue with CCS right now.
It's a really interesting question, and I agree that CCS has been demonstrated. The technologies are available. There are companies willing to provide the guarantees. There are still challenges. We're at the early stage of the deployment pathway, and I think both a carrot and a stick approach is warranted if your goal is to support widespread deployment of CCS. And I think particularly in the power sector, any directly mandated approach at this stage is perhaps not going to actually incentivize CCS. It's going to incentivize investment in alternative, more mature technologies, whether that's gas or renewables. So I think a mix of incentives and carrots is warranted at this early stage. Just going back to the question on the afforestation, at the IEA we don't look directly at afforestation issues. We take data and the projections from the IPCC, but we do factor in growing reliance on sort of natural sequestration, if I can put it that way, through trees. But that in itself makes a contribution to achieving climate targets. But again, it's part of the story. This is always going to be an and strategy for getting to the 2-degree target. So it is factored in. We don't model it specifically, but we factor it into the sort of what the energy sector contribution has to be. And it can play a role, but it's not going to be a silver bullet, of course.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think when you look at the IEA projections, the issue of negative emissions starts becoming increasingly important. There's bio-CCS, a big part of the negative emissions story, and afforestation is also creating another sink, which can also draw things out of the atmosphere, maybe.
That's correct. We do have quite a bit of bioenergy with CCS in our model, and particularly this year when we looked at a beyond 2-degree scenario, which had the energy sector achieving carbon neutrality globally by 2060, and was consistent broadly with a future temperature target of around 1.75 degrees, or temperature outcome, I should say. And there was significant bioenergy with CCS. Most of the CCS investment started shifting towards bioenergy with CCS. And we had to really look at then, given bioenergy is going to be a limited resource, what's the optimal use of that bioenergy? And more and more of that bioenergy needed to be used in conjunction with CCS to maximise the climate benefits. This perhaps goes back to the earlier question on the role of bioenergy versus fossil fuel CCS. I think the investments that we're making in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of storage, that has future benefits to supporting negative emissions and bioenergy with CCS.
So why don't we do one more round of questions, then at the end I'll ask each of the panelists to give a concluding comment. In the front.
Thanks, Lee.
Given the variety of technologies that are out there and that you've discussed. So I'm interested, okay, so maybe this is 20 years out, but what are the technologies for utilization that you're most excited about beyond EOR? And what do you think the market opportunities are for them? As Philippe has pointed to, where is the most economically exciting opportunity?
Brad Crabtree, Great Plains Institute. Just an observation and then a request for comments on cost. I really feel that the cost discussion here has been unwarranted in its pessimism. Right now in the U.S. market, you can retrofit a power plant for carbon capture typically at less cost per ton of carbon reduced than building solar PV. And in some markets, it's cheaper than wind. Again, when you include the cost of subsidies and build everything in, the actual cost of reducing a ton of CO2 from carbon capture, even in the power sector, it's already viable from that perspective. And so given all the examples we know of pretty dramatic scale up of technology in the energy industry, whether it's scrubbers on power plants or the transformation of hydraulic fracturing for shale gas production, I mean, these are seismic changes in the industry. I guess I'd like some thoughts on why the skepticism or pessimism about the ability to scale this up, because frankly, I don't see it as infeasible.
Jeff, you want to start, and then we'll come down the line?
Sure. Let me start with the utilization question. The issue that we need to look at there is scale. How big is the opportunity? How big is the market? And I'm pretty excited actually about the applications in cement and aggregates, so cement and concrete, and the opportunity to utilize CO2 both in the cement curing process and in the creation of aggregates and embedding the CO2 in the concrete. The reason for that is because it's such a massive market that while the costs currently are high, over time, because the market is so large, there's a big opportunity there. So I'm going with cement and concrete. With respect to the comparative economics that Brad just mentioned, you call it pessimism. I think the challenge there is not at the broad scale. There's a lot of information, a lot of data that shows that on a macro scale, it makes good economic sense to build carbon capture instead of some alternatives. The challenge is in the way businesses make decisions, investment decisions, and that's on a per project basis. And if you can't get the cost to be less than, or sorry, the income to be more than the cost, then they're not going to give a green light on a corporate basis for the go-ahead. So that's where the incentives, the tax incentives and other incentives come into play and are pretty essential, because that's the way decisions are being made, is on a project basis.
Rick?
On utilization, one thing that, of course, biofuels is a good potential utilization. Scale is an issue, but there's one technology that people are developing now, which I think is very interesting, we ought to pay attention to, and that is the ability to use CO2 to make fuels. Of course, if you make fuels with them, that carbon will ultimately end up in the atmosphere, but the idea is that it's a substitute for a fuel that would have come from an initial production of oil, a displacement. So as a transitional technology, it might be quite good, and I think the costs of that actually are coming down to a very reasonable point at this point. On Brad's point, first of all, people don't know Brad. Brad's leading a major initiative in Congress, which is called the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, and it's a coalition of fossil energy and environmental groups trying to convince the federal government through a legislation, a bill that now has 22 or 25 sponsors in the Senate to provide a credit the same way we have production tax credits for wind. Be production tax credit in effect for carbon sequestration. It would be a nice boost, and it would make a difference. I think Brad's absolutely right, and I think Jeff's response is absolutely correct as well. I would only say, I mean, we have to come down the ski tip, from the first plant to the nth plant. We have to do that on cost. We've done it on everything else. If we look at the first wind turbines that we installed, they're not very good compared to today's wind turbines, but we got started, and it helped us come down the cost curve. Same with solar panels. So that will happen with carbon capture and sequestration. We spend enough. Julio Friedman, who was in the last administration in the fossil energy, was fond of pointing out that in the past couple of decades, we've spent globally, and I think you referenced this in a different way, we've spent globally $3 trillion on renewable energy and $20 billion on CCS. We're not very far down the cost curve on it yet, but I agree with Brad's point. But an even bigger point, I think, is we got started on cost per megawatt hour for energy, not even considering capacity, and the system needs capacity. This metric, levelized cost of energy, which looks good for renewables, is a terrible metric. the metric ought to be, on the power side, it ought to be, what is the cost of serving a megawatt of firm load when you're using intermittent energy to supply some of the megawatt hours to that 1 megawatt? And that changes your way you look at the grid costs quite differently. But on the climate standpoint, we really missed the boat, because what we should be thinking about is what is the cost per ton of carbon avoided or per ton of greenhouse gas avoided in the atmosphere. And on that, today, with all the cost challenges of CCS, it's easy to demonstrate that CCS is a less costly way of avoiding emissions to the atmosphere than renewables. And yet, that's not the way we think about it. We think about the cost of the energy, not the cost per ton avoided. And I'll have to talk separately with you about the forestry point. I'm sorry I didn't answer that when you asked it.
Sam?
Thanks. On the utilization question, I would agree that cement and concrete curing is a more mature and interesting opportunity for CO2 use. I agree that this space is ripe for further innovation, and the potential is quite large. I would again reference the sort of criteria that I think we need to look at these opportunities in terms of scalability and the permanency of this CO2 removal. And of course, recognising that it's, potentially this near-term driver for investment in some niche applications, and we should absolutely be looking for those opportunities while also pursuing, the broader and larger opportunity of CO2 storage, geological storage. On the economics of CCS, you're absolutely right to be looking at it from a sort of a broader perspective, but I think the challenge, as Jeff mentioned, it really comes back to how plants make investment decisions. And in addition to the additional cost associated with CCS is the challenge of how does a utility undertake geological storage. So in the US, there's been the opportunity for enhanced oil recovery. You've got an extensive pipeline network, CO2 pipeline network. So that's made that side of the equation somewhat easier, I think, for some facilities in the US. But in other areas, it's, you don't have already that built infrastructure. Utilities don't have the subsurface expertise that's needed to assess and prove up a geological storage site in proximity to their plant. So there is the cost element, but there's also some of the practical challenges about deploying CCS, and that's really where we need a much more, a strengthened coalition of industry and governments looking at this issue, because clearly we'll need a strong involvement of the oil and gas industry with their expertise, and to be partnering with industrial players, with utilities, to be able to bring this sort of CCS jigsaw puzzle together.
Great. So final words. We'll start with you, Sam, and go down the line.
Well, firstly, thanks for the questions and the discussion. It's been really, really interesting to hear the perspectives. Perhaps I would just touch on the role of the US in terms of its leadership on CCS, not just on the projects, but I think in the international outreach now, the US partnerships with China and with some European countries to develop CCS. We're seeing this as a really promising development with your EOR expertise, particularly being able to transfer that to the Middle East and to China to help spur sort of more investment in CCS. We're seeing that leadership also at the International Energy Agency with the recent summit that we've held. So, and through the Clean Energy Ministerial Initiative that the US is now leading with some other SEM member countries. So I think this renewed global push that we're seeing for CCS is exceptionally promising. We look forward to supporting that, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Rick?
I think that CCS provides a good example of the old line about where you stand depends on where you sit. And for a long time, the climate community in the US, only small portions of it have really understood or supported CCS. There's been in the US, there's been a belief that everything we need to do for climate can be done with renewable energy. And I've talked about a couple of reasons why that's just not the case, although I'm a huge advocate of renewable energy. So we have trouble in the U.S. particularly thinking about climate in terms of decarbonization. And if we're going to decarbonize, which is what the climate requires, to get to zero net emissions is what Paris is based on. Not zero emissions, but having sinks that match what your continued sources are. If we're going to get there, we can't get there without carbon capture and sequestration. So I believe that, of course, just as Jeff said earlier, it's necessary and therefore it's inevitable if humans are going to do anything about climate. I would just urge one thing about let's not despair completely on the subject of the Trump administration. I'm not a fan, but I will say that I do believe there's a path forward on CCS, even if, as you heard this morning, there's no reference made in the administration to doing it for climate reasons. The head of Summit Power when I joined was Don Hodel, who was the former Secretary of Energy for Ronald Reagan and Secretary of the Interior, a quite conservative Republican. And I'm sure that Don does not accept the climate hypothesis even as a starting point. So when people asked, well, why are you trying to develop carbon capture plants? He said, because we have these resources and we're not going to be able to develop them without carbon capture. It doesn't matter what I think. That's the way it is. The reality today and the reality for the administration is that projects, new projects, especially projects using coal, if they want to use coal, they will not get built without carbon capture. And it doesn't have to be because of climate. It's because of the realities of getting them permitted and the realities of getting them financed. So let's take some strength and confidence from what Mr. Winberg said today and imagine that we can continue to move forward on carbon capture without necessarily agreeing that the reasons for which it's being done. And I think that's why there is a progress. I want to mention, too, that Brad, as I mentioned, has this initiative, which I think is very, very important in Congress. Surprising thing about it, remarkable thing about it, is it's completely bipartisan. These 25 senators who are co-sponsoring it is almost an equal mix of Democrats and Republicans. So it doesn't have to be a partisan issue, and it doesn't have to be tied directly to climate. But it has to advance, and in my view, without it advancing, then we're sunk on climate.
Thanks, Jeff. Some closing words?
I'll wrap up by saying that there's plenty of evidence out there that carbon capture as a technology or a suite of technologies is proven. It's affordable, it's versatile, and it's essential for numerous reasons. What excites me a lot is the innovation aspect of it. It's a really interesting time to be in the energy space. In the status report, John Elkington, who I mentioned earlier, says, in a way that only he can, brilliant minds, many brilliant minds are beavering away at this issue of carbon utilization. It's an exciting place to be, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Some days are very daunting, because the challenges are pretty huge, both from a climate perspective and from a technology or from a technology adoption perspective. But I'm happy to be in this space, excited to be in this space, and looking forward to working with all of you to take it forward.
Great. Well, I would like to thank the entire panel for a very interesting presentation. I think it's clear that CCS is very important. I think something that's striking to me visually is we started with a room which was essentially standing room only, and we're an hour and a half in, and most of you are still here. So I think, Sarah, what that reflects is that there is a latent demand for this issue, and it's something that it's important that we follow up on. So if you all join me in thanking the panel. And thank you to all of you for attending and for those very stimulating questions.